The grill room at the Four Seasons Hotel in New York was a place where every detail was meticulously planned to offer the finest dining experience. Impeccable leather chairs, silverware gleaming under the warm glow of chandeliers, and service that bordered on perfection. But that night something felt off. Have you ever stopped to think about how life can change drastically in just a matter of seconds? How an ordinary day can suddenly turn into a nightmare, or just as quickly bring an unexpected miracle? That's exactly what happened there that night, and the lesson that would follow would change everything. Barron Trump was used to the professionalism of the finest restaurants. Seated at his reserved table, he noticed something unusual. The waiter serving him seemed disconnected, distant, and every word he spoke carried a weight. His tone was cold, his patience non-existent, his gestures impersonal, completely out of place in an establishment like this. He wasn't just indifferent, he was outright rude. He placed the plates on the table carelessly, never once making eye contact, and when Barron politely said, "Thank you," the man simply turned his back and walked away. Any other customer might have felt offended and demanded disciplinary action, but Barron, instead of reacting, simply observed. His security team waited outside, ready to escort him as soon as he finished his dinner. But Barron didn't leave immediately. Something about the waiter's behavior intrigued him. It didn't seem like simple rudeness or negligence. He looked exhausted, as if he were fighting a battle no one could see. In silence, the young man finished his meal, occasionally glancing at the waiter, who was now whispering in a hushed argument with a colleague near the kitchen. His face carried an expression of fatigue that went beyond physical exhaustion. Before leaving, Barron spotted the restaurant manager hurrying between tables and decided to approach him. "Has that waiter been working here long?" he asked in a neutral tone. The manager, caught off guard by the question, hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yes, for many years." "But why?" he asked, puzzled. Barron lifted his gaze, thoughtful. He seemed different. The manager took a deep breath, adjusted his tie, and glanced toward the kitchen door, where the waiter had just disappeared. "Perhaps we should talk somewhere more private," he suggested, motioning for Barron to follow him to his office. The manager's office was a modest room tucked away at the back of the restaurant, far from the clatter of silverware and the murmur of conversations. Barron stepped inside and settled into a leather armchair as the manager closed the door behind them, as if he were about to share a secret. "That man who served you, he's not usually like this," he began, folding his hands on the desk. "He's one of our best employees, always received praise from customers, always had a smile on his face, but in recent months he's changed and I couldn't bring myself to fire him." The manager paused, as if the words were too heavy to say out loud. It was then that Barron began to hear a story that went far beyond a simple case of poor service. That waiter, who now seemed moody and distant, had once been a cheerful and dedicated man. Someone who worked hard to provide the best for his family, but life has a cruel way of testing even the strongest. 6 months ago, he received the worst news a son could ever hear. His parents had been in a car accident and died on the spot. It was sudden, brutal. A truck ran a red light and crashed into their vehicle at full speed. He never even had the chance to say goodbye. While he was still trying to cope with his grief, another devastating blow followed. His wife started experiencing unusual pains and went to see a doctor. After a series of tests, the diagnosis came: advanced stage breast cancer. Overnight, the woman who had always been his rock suddenly became entirely dependent on him. Aggressive treatments, chemotherapy, devastating side effects. And as if that weren't enough, the worst thing of all was time, or rather the lack of it. The time he needed to take care of her and their son. The time he used to spend at his second job, which he could no longer keep. Barron remained silent, absorbing everything. Suddenly the waiter's coldness made sense. His impatience, the distant look in his eyes, the sharp tone. It wasn't arrogance, it was pain. He's broken inside at the manager's side. I should fire him, but how could I, knowing everything he's going through? Barron didn't respond right away. He just glanced at the door, where outside that man continued his shift, unaware that at that very moment someone was about to change his life forever. The manager hesitated before, continuing, as if carefully choosing his words. And there's something else, he said, his voice heavier now. Barron kept his gaze steady. His son, a 12-year-old boy, is losing his sight. The silence that followed was suffocating. He was diagnosed with retinitis pigmentosa a few months ago. At first, it was just trouble seeing in the dark, small accidents around the house. But now, he trips over things right in front of him. He struggles to read, and doctors say that in a few years he may go completely blind. Barron felt the weight of those words hit him. He tried to imagine what it must be like for a father to watch his own child slowly lose his vision, knowing there was nothing he could do to stop it. How does someone keep smiling while carrying a burden like that? How do you stay the same person when everything around you is falling apart? That waiter was no longer just a rude employee in Barron's eyes. He was a man, fighting against everything life was throwing at him, struggling to hold his family together as the world pushed him further down. What breaks my heart the most, the manager continued, is that he's tried everything. He's been to multiple doctors, searched for experimental treatments, even considered selling his apartment to pay for a specialist in another state. But the truth is, he's out of options. The manager ran a hand over his face, visibly troubled. And now he can't hide it anymore. He tries to hold in the anger, the frustration, but it slips out in his gestures, in his eyes, in the way he speaks to customers. He's not mad at the world, Barron. He's just exhausted. Barron didn't respond immediately. He simply stood up from his chair, took a deep breath and looked toward the hallway where the waiter was passing by, completely unaware that his story was being told at that very moment. I need some information, Barron finally said, breaking the silence. His name, his wife's name, his son's name, and if possible his wife's phone number. The manager furrowed his brows, visibly surprised. What are you planning to do? Barron cast him a discreet look. Help, but he can't know it was me. On the other side of the restaurant, the waiter continued his shift, completely unaware that, before the night was over, his life would change forever. The weight of everything he was going through made each order feel like a struggle. Every tray he carried like a burden. He had no energy for politeness or smiles. His mind was drowning in worry. His son's voice still echoed in his head, asking for help to read a simple book. The image of his wife, frail in bed, haunted him. The crushing feeling of helplessness was overwhelming, and deep down, he knew that if things continued this way, neither his body nor his mind would hold up much longer. When his shift finally ended, he walked to the back of the restaurant and sat on a worn-out wooden bench. He felt as if the world was slowly closing in on him, pressing down with an unbearable weight. He pulled out his phone and opened the photo gallery. There they were, pictures of his family before everything collapsed. His wife, smiling. His son, playing in the park. His parents, laughing at a New Year's Eve celebration. It all seemed so far away now. He closed his eyes and a single tear escaped down his cheek. And then, for the first time in what felt like forever, he did something he had long forgotten how to do. He prayed. It wasn't a long prayer, nor was it filled with eloquent words. It was just a whisper, choked by pain. God, I don't know what to do anymore. If you still hear me, I need help. The night around him was silent. The cold wind brushed against his face, and he remained there, head bowed, not expecting an answer. He was tired of waiting for miracles. Deep inside, he wasn't even sure he believed in them anymore. But the moment he uttered that desperate plea, the impossible began to move. Meanwhile, across the city, Barron Trump now had all the information he needed. He didn't want recognition nor applause, only to make a difference. He picked up his phone and began making calls to the right people, specialists, renowned doctors, hospital directors. He knew that with his name, doors would open, doors that the waiter could never access on his own. But none of this would ever be revealed, because, after all, when the right hand gives, the left hand doesn't need to know. The next morning began like all the others with fear. The waiter got up early and took a long look around his home. What once felt full of life now resembled a hospital room. The morning light streamed through the window, but it didn't bring warmth. Instead, it highlighted the paleness of his wife's face. She tried to smile when she saw him, but it never reached her eyes. The scarf covering her head was a cruel reminder that chemotherapy was progressing. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, already knowing the answer. The nights were long, filled with pain and nausea. "It was bearable," she murmured, not wanting to worry him. The diagnosis had come months earlier, and since then the word cancer had cast a dark shadow over their lives. At first, it was just a small lump in her left breast, something that didn't seem too concerning, but after more detailed tests, the doctor was blunt. Invasive ductal carcinoma stage 3. The tumor had already spread to nearby lymph nodes. The options were limited: aggressive chemotherapy, surgery, and then radiation therapy. But all of this required money, a lot of money. Their health insurance covered only part of the costs, and the expenses for medications, tests, and travel were a burden he couldn't fathom how to carry. How could he pay for the treatment when he could barely keep up with the household bills? He also visited his son's room, where the boy was still sleeping. But as he watched him, memories of 2 weeks ago came flooding back, a memory of yet another devastating diagnosis. The boy, who used to run carefree around the house, had started bumping into furniture. At first it seemed like normal clumsiness for a 12-year-old, a little distraction, maybe tiredness. But over time, the stumbles became frequent. Sunlight began bothering him, and his eyes would water without reason. "Dad, why does everything get dark when the light is low?" he had asked one night. Concerned, the waiter had taken his son to an ophthalmologist who ordered a series of tests. And then the devastating news came: retinitis pigmentosa. The doctor explained with clinical detachment it was a genetic, progressive, and incurable disease. The rods and cones in the boy's retina were degenerating. First, the difficulty seeing in the dark, then the loss of peripheral vision. In a few years, total blindness. There's not much we can do beyond monitoring and helping him adapt to his new reality, the doctor had said. But how does a father accept that? How do you prepare to watch your child lose his sight day by day? A father working as a mirror. Waiter felt the room spin, but he couldn't collapse. His son looked up at him, searching for reassurance. "I'm going to go blind, aren't I, Dad?" His throat tightened. He couldn't lie. He simply held his son's hand and said, "No matter what happens, I'll never leave you alone." Now he was caught between two impossible battles. On one side, a wife fighting an aggressive cancer. On the other, a son watching the world around him slowly fade into darkness. And in the middle of it all was him, a man with no money, no time, and no options. The hospital had already warned him that without payment, his wife wouldn't be able to continue treatment. The doctor suggested visual therapy to slow his son's condition, but how could he afford that? The waiter closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "God, I don't know what to do." He didn't even realized he was whispering out loud. Maybe he no longer believed in miracles. But that night, something began to shift. A week later, something unexpected happened. His phone rang, and on the other end of the line, a formal voice informed him that his wife had been accepted into a specialized treatment program at one of the country's top hospitals. The shock was immediate. There must be some mistake. "I can't afford this." The representative paused and replied calmly, "The costs have already been covered." He sat on the edge of the bed, gripping the phone with trembling hands. How was this possible? Who could have done this for them? Before he could process it, the phone rang again. This time, it was a renowned ophthalmologist offering a free consultation for his son. "I heard about your case. I'd like to, personally, evaluate him and explore possible treatment options." His mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation, but there was none. Within hours, his seemingly hopeless reality was transforming. What once felt impossible was now becoming real. In the days that followed, the blessings kept coming. Medical bills were paid off without explanation. A sum of money large enough to urgent debts appeared in his bank account. His wife began the treatment that once seemed out of reach, and his son underwent evaluations with the nation's leading specialists. But the strangest part was that no one could explain who was behind it all. Whenever he asked, the response was vague, just a generous donor. He wanted to believe it was a miracle, but doubt still lingered. Who would do something like this without expecting anything in return? Had his desperate prayer that night actually been heard? Regardless, for the first time in months, he fell asleep with a lighter heart. Deep down, he felt that sooner or later, he would discover the truth. But until then, he simply closed his eyes and whispered, "Whoever you are, may God bless you." 6 months later, his shift had just ended when the manager called him into the office. He walked down the hallway, his heart pounding, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Was he finally getting fired? He knew his attitude hadn't been the same for a long time. He had been struggling, and it showed. With his head down, he stepped into the office, bracing himself for the worst. But to his surprise, the manager wasn't angry. On the contrary, there was an unusual warmth in his eyes. "Sit down," he said calmly. The waiter obeyed, but his chest felt tight. The manager took a deep breath before speaking. "You've noticed how things have changed in your life, haven't you?" The waiter frowned, hesitant. "Your wife received treatment? Your son was seen by one of the best specialists in the country? Your medical debts were paid? Do you really think all of that happened by chance?" A shiver ran down the waiter's spine. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He had never questioned where the help was coming from. He had been too desperate to do anything but accept it. But now, hearing these words, he felt something shift inside him. Something was about to be revealed. The manager gave him a knowing smile. "It was one of our customers, someone who saw your pain and chose to act in silence, expecting nothing in return." The waiter froze. "Someone," he repeated, trying to process what he had just heard. His heart pounded faster. The manager hesitated for a moment and then said the name that would change everything: Barron Trump. For a moment, the waiter forgot how to breathe. His mind flashed back to that night. The way he had treated Barron, the coldness in his tone, the way he had dismissed him without a second thought. He had humiliated a young man who, instead of retaliating, had chosen to help him. The very person he had disregarded was the instrument God used to change his life. Tears welled up. Before he could hold them back, he stood up, feeling his legs weak beneath him. "I need to speak to him. I need to thank him." The manager nodded. A few days later, Barron returned to the restaurant. When the young man walked in, the waiter approached him slowly, his emotions overwhelming him. "Mr. Trump," his voice faltered. He lowered his head, ashamed. I was so unfair to you, and yet you helped me. Barron smiled and replied with simple but profound words. Pain tests us, but kindness defines us. Never let your battles turn you into someone who spreads pain. Always choose compassion. The waiter stood there, his head bowed as Barron's words echoed in his mind. Pain tests us, but kindness defines us. He felt a lump in his throat, not out of shame, but because he had finally realized something he had been blind to. His pain had hardened his heart, making him take his suffering out on others. He had become exactly the kind of person he once despised, bitter, cold, and disconnected. But Barron hadn't responded with anger or resentment. He had responded with grace, and that had struck him deeper than any words ever could. The tears he had held back for months finally fell. But he wasn't just crying over everything he had lost. He was crying because despite everything, hope still existed. He looked at Barron, his voice trembling. I don't know how to thank you. Barron placed a hand on his shoulder and smiled. Don't have to thank me. Just pay it forward. The waiter frowned, confused. What do you mean? Barron nodded. One day when you have the chance, do for someone else what was done for you. That's the only gratitude that truly matters. The following months were still filled with challenges, but now he carried a different spirit. He learned to treat every customer with the respect he once struggled to show. He started talking to his colleagues, seeing their pain as well. His wife responded well to the treatment, and his son, though still facing vision loss, now had access to proper medical care. And more than anything, he learned that life is full of pain, but also redemption. Because in the end, it's not our circumstances that define us, it's how we choose to respond to them. If this story touched your heart, don't leave without sharing your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how this journey of compassion and redemption made you feel. Don't forget to hit the like button so more people can be reached by this powerful message. And of course, subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any inspiring stories like this one. Together, we can spread more hope into the world. Thank you for being part of our community.